r/NoSleep. If the shadows flicker at 3:07, pretend you can't see them. For the past week, strange things have been happening in my home, things I can't quite explain or dismiss. It started innocently enough, a flicker of the hallway lights, a strange shadow darting across the living room wall, subtle enough to brush off. But then last night, things escalated. It was 3:07 a.m. when I was jolted awake. Not by a noise, but by the overwhelming, eerie silence. The silence was so thick, so empty, that it seemed to press on my eardrums. I turned to my wife, Mia, expecting her to be asleep. Instead, I was met with an empty bed. I felt a pang of confusion. Mia never got up in the night without letting me know. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 3:07 a.m. exactly. I turned to the door, where I could see the faint outline of the hallway, dimly lit by the street lamp outside. But then, just as I focused my eyes, I noticed them, shadows flickering along the walls, dark and formless, twisting unnaturally. "Mia?" I called out softly, my voice a whisper. The shadows froze. There was no response, just the deafening silence. Then, like a scene straight from a nightmare, the shadows began to shift and swirl, slowly forming into something that resembled her. Only it wasn't really her. Mia, or whatever had taken her form, stood in the hallway, her posture unnaturally stiff, her head cocked at an impossible angle as if something were pulling her body into a marionette pose. Her eyes, wide and vacant, stared at me with a look that I can only describe as hungry. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to get up, to run to her, shake her awake, if she was even asleep, but some instinct told me to stay perfectly still. And then she began to move. With slow, deliberate steps, she started walking down the hallway toward the boys' room. Our twins, Jamie and Lucas, had been fast asleep when we tucked them in hours before. My heart pounded as I watched her disappear into their room, the shadows slithering behind her like tendrils. I forced myself to breathe, focusing on the clock that now read 3:08. I told myself it was a bad dream, just a strange, vivid nightmare. But then I heard it. The low, raspy sound of her voice drifting from down the hallway, an eerie, almost mechanical repetition of one phrase. "Are you awake? Are you awake?" Every hair on my body stood on end as I heard the boys' soft voices respond, "No, Mommy." Seconds later, I saw Mia's shadow returning to the hallway. She was dragging something behind her, something that was heavy, scraping along the hardwood floor. My heart stopped when I realized it was one of Jamie's favorite stuffed animals, its head twisted to the side at an unnatural angle, its eyes missing. I clutched the sheets and held my breath, praying she wouldn't notice me, praying that whatever was pretending to be my wife would believe I was asleep. I closed my eyes, but I could feel her presence, standing just outside our bedroom door. The air grew cold, like something otherworldly was breathing right beside me. And then, in a chilling whisper, I heard her say, "I know you're not asleep." My eyes shot open. She was standing right over me, her eyes wide and glassy, a terrible grin stretching across her face. I was paralyzed with fear as her cold hand reached out and pressed against my chest. The pressure was immense, like she was trying to crush me with just her fingertips. Then, abruptly, the silence was broken by the microwave in the kitchen beeping. I gasped, inhaling a desperate breath as Mia's form relaxed, her eyes returning to normal, her body slumping as if she were waking up from a deep sleep. She blinked at me, confused. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she asked, her voice back to its usual, gentle tone. I struggled to find words, to tell her what I'd seen, but before I could, the boys came running down the hall, clutching their stuffed animals, asking why I was acting so strange. They didn't remember a thing. The next morning, I tried to tell her about what happened, about the shadows and her unsettling grin. She brushed it off, laughing nervously. It was just a nightmare, she insisted, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of doubt, a hint of fear she couldn't hide. Determined to prove to myself that it wasn't just a dream, I set up cameras that night, aiming them down the hallway and in our room. I needed to see what was happening, to capture it. I was ready. I knew something sinister was lurking in the house, and I was prepared to finally confront it. Once again, I woke at exactly 3:07 a.m., the same unnatural silence filling the house. My phone was frozen on the time, refusing to change. I could barely make out the shadows on the screen, flickering and shifting down the hallway. I turned to the hallway, but this time, it wasn't just Mia. Both Jamie and Lucas stood there, side by side with her, their eyes wide and unblinking, faces stretched into those grotesque, unnatural grins. The three of them were staring directly at me. And then, like clockwork, the whisper started, only this time, it came from all three of them. "Are you awake? Are you awake?" My heart pounded as I tried to reach for my phone to record, but my hand wouldn't move. I was frozen, helpless as they took one slow step forward, then another, each step echoing through the silence. They stopped just inches from my bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they would go away, hoping I could pretend to be asleep. The bed creaked as they leaned in closer. I could feel their cold breath on my face, hear the soft hum of their whisper just inches from my ear. The next thing I knew, I was waking up. My alarm was blaring, sunlight streaming through the window. Everything was back to normal. Except for the red marks on my chest, bruises shaped like fingers. When I checked the footage, I almost threw up. The video was clear, chillingly so. I watched as Mia and the boys wandered the hallway, their faces twisted into nightmarish smiles, their eyes wide and empty, bodies moving like puppets on strings. And then, as the clock struck 3:08, they all turned toward the camera, staring directly at it, as if they knew I was watching. And in unison, they mouthed one last message. "Don't let us catch you awake again." That night, I lay in bed, clutching the blankets and pretending to sleep, the clock ticking closer to 3:07. All I could do was pray. Pray that I'd make it through the night. And now, I can only wonder, if you're reading this, whatever you do, remember. If the shadows flicker at 3:07, pretend you can't see them. But sometimes, pretending isn't enough. The following night, I steeled myself for another showdown, trying to convince myself that the night before had been a fluke. Yet deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I'd sealed my fate by acknowledging them, by daring to stay awake. I'd heard stories growing up, whispers about the witching hour, that window where the boundary between our world and others thins. But I'd always laughed them off, a skeptic at heart. That night, as the clock ticked closer to 3:07, I sat in my bedroom, armed with a flashlight and a bat, my phone recording once again. Mia was fast asleep beside me, blissfully unaware, or perhaps choosing not to believe. Just as my heart began to slow, thinking maybe, just maybe, I was safe, the lights flickered. The same suffocating silence draped over the room, wrapping around me like a heavy cloak. I gripped the flashlight, fingers trembling, as shadows started pulling outside our bedroom door. This time, I could see their outlines more clearly, sharper and darker than before. It wasn't just Mia and the boys. These shapes were taller, looming figures, their forms stretching and contorting, unfurling themselves down the hallway like fingers reaching out for something. And that's when I saw her. A dark figure emerged, cloaked in shadows, her features concealed except for her eyes, hollow, staring with an intensity that felt as if it could burn right through me. Her presence was suffocating, filling the space with an unrelenting malice. I tried to move, to shake Mia awake, but my muscles refused to obey. The air felt charged, thick, as though the shadows themselves were alive, pulsing, surrounding us. The woman's mouth twisted into a smile as she stepped closer, her voice low and insidious. "You shouldn't have watched," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping against glass. "Now, you belong to us." My heart hammered, my mind racing with regret. She raised her hand, pointing directly at me. I felt a chill run down my spine, an electric shock of terror as something cold and invisible gripped my throat. It was like she was siphoning the life out of me, inch by inch. Suddenly, Mia stirred beside me, her hand brushing against mine. The sensation jolted me, breaking the invisible hold, and I gasped for air, feeling the darkness pull back slightly. Mia," I stammered, my voice barely a croak. "Wake up." She blinked, disoriented, but before I could say anything else, her face twisted in terror as she caught sight of the shadows pooling at our feet, creeping up the walls. She clutched my arm, her voice a trembling whisper. "Don't move," she warned. They see movement." I swallowed hard, willing myself to stay perfectly still, watching as the figures seemed to waver, almost as if frustrated by our silence. But they were patient, lingering just outside our reach. Minutes ticked by, each second stretching into an eternity as we sat frozen, listening to the low, guttural sounds of their whispers. Then, without warning, the silence shattered. From down the hall, Jamie and Lucas screamed, piercing the night with a terror I'd never heard before. Instinct took over. I jumped up, ignoring the icy grip of fear, and bolted down the hall with Mia at my heels, flashlight swinging wildly in my hands. We burst into their room, and there they were, Jamie and Lucas huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Shadows danced around them, flickering along the walls in unnatural patterns, contorting into grotesque shapes. "Daddy." Jamie's voice was barely audible, choked with fear. "They're here. They won't leave us alone." My stomach dropped. I scanned the room, searching for a way to shield them, to protect them. Without thinking, I pulled the boys into my arms, whispering reassurances I didn't believe. The shadows crept closer, crawling up the walls, stretching toward us with unnatural, grasping fingers. Then, a low, guttural voice echoed from somewhere deep within the shadows. It was the same voice from before, but now it was layered, a chorus of whispers overlapping each other, filling the room with a horrible, cacophonous symphony. "Join us. Join us. Join us." I pressed my back against the wall, clutching my family, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere left to go. The shadows closed in, the walls seeming to stretch and ripple as if reality itself was bending to their will. Then, the room fell silent. The shadows paused, and for one brief, horrible moment, I thought we were safe. But then I realized. They were waiting. Waiting for me. Mia clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth forming silent words of a prayer. I turned my gaze back to the shadows, the twisted, grotesque forms that seemed to leer at me with a dark, malevolent intelligence. "Tell us," the voice whispered, cold and cutting, "will you come willingly, or shall we take your family instead?" The air turned ice cold, and I felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. I knew, in some horrible, instinctual way, that they were serious, that this was not a mere threat but a binding promise. The shadows flickered, their dark forms pulsing with anticipation, waiting for my answer. "No," I whispered, barely able to find my voice. "You can't have them." The shadows shifted, a dark chuckle rippling through the air as they loomed closer, surrounding us completely. Their grip tightened around my mind, the room fading as my vision darkened, the edges blurring as I felt myself being pulled away. And then, as if by some miracle, the sound of the microwave's timer beeped, slicing through the tension. The shadows recoiled, their forms shuddering and retreating as if burned by the sudden intrusion of sound. I gasped, feeling the weight lift, the icy grip releasing its hold. Blinking, I found myself standing alone in the room, Mia and the boys gone, the shadows gone. The faint glow of morning light seeped through the window, bathing the room in warmth, dissolving the last remnants of darkness. But something was wrong. I stumbled out into the hallway, calling for Mia, for the boys, my heart pounding. The house was empty, silent. My calls echoed off the walls, unanswered. Then I saw them, not in the hallway, not in their rooms, but in the shadows, lurking just beyond the veil of light. Mia and the boys stood there, their eyes wide and vacant, their forms distorted, as though caught between worlds. The dark figure was beside them, her hollow eyes locked onto me, her mouth twisting into a satisfied smile. "They're safe," she whispered, her voice like nails scraping on glass. "Safe. With me." And as she faded into the shadows, taking my family with her, I understood the truth. I had bargained my soul for theirs, a twisted trade that had only delayed the inevitable. Now, every night at 3:07, I wait, watching the shadows flicker and dance, feeling their cold presence brush against my skin. They don't come close anymore. They know I'm already theirs. But sometimes, just before dawn, I hear their voices, faint and distant, whispering from the darkness. "We'll be waiting. When you're ready to join us." And so, I wait, each night feeling the pull of their world grow stronger, knowing that someday, I won't be able to resist. And when that day comes, I will step into the shadows, and I will be with them. But until then, I sit alone, clinging to the last vestiges of light, hoping that, just maybe, if I pretend not to see them, I can hold onto my soul just a little bit longer.